There's a criticism of the COVID relief bill that I think is incredibly substantive because I've made it a lot myself. Namely, the Democrats said $2,000 checks immediately when they were campaigning. Warnock and Ossoff said it. And then not only did they not do it immediately, they didn't do $2,000 checks at all. They didn't even just do the $1,400 checks that you know, when you add the $600 it makes $2,000 because they means tested it even further, so they definitely lied and went back on their word. That's the criticism that's legit. The other criticism that's legit is you said $15 minimum wage, you didn't do it, and you didn't even fight for it. You immediately caved on it. So those are the criticisms that are legit. There are many criticisms of this bill that are not at all legit. They're incredibly stupid. Well, here's Fox Business Network. You got Karl Rove and Stuart Varney. They're going to give us some of those terrible, horrendous, astoundingly bad criticisms.
All right, let's look at this headline. It's quite long, but I will read it for you. Dems nix GOP spending bill improvements. It's popular now, but voters may regret the $1.9 trillion expense by November 2022. Who wrote that? Karl Rove wrote it, and he joins us now. Karl, welcome back to the program. It's great to see you, sir.
Thank you, Stuart.
Do you think that these $1,400 checks will backfire? I would have thought they've been wildly popular.
Well, look, we're a practical people. 75% of Americans are going to get these checks. And how many of those people are going to say, why am I getting a check? I've got a couple of friends in South Carolina, two retired ladies, a mother-in-law and aunt of a friend of mine. They got their $600 checks last year, and their first response was, why did they send them to us? And think about this. The United States Senate turned down an amendment to deny checks to felons. People who've been in jail for a year. So they got in there before COVID started. They're going to get checks. College students are going to get checks. They refuse to go on record and say, we're going to deny checks to illegal aliens. So I think people are going to say, okay, fine, thanks for sending out the money, but did I really need it? And what's going to really bring this to a boil is the fact that this bill is so expensive. And people are going to say, did we really need to spend $1.8, $1.9 trillion in order to deal with an issue? Think about this, Stuart. In the bill, vaccines have between $14 and $20 billion worth of spending. If you take all of the health-related COVID-19 issues in here, it's between $100 to $160 billion total, everything. $1.8 trillion total. 8.5% or less of the bill is actually devoted to COVID. And think about this. This is an emergency, right? We spend $2.3 trillion this fiscal year, that is to say, by the end of September, but we spend $692 billion under this emergency bill over the next 10 years. We spend $458 billion in fiscal year 22. We spent $114 billion in fiscal year 23. We spent $63 billion in fiscal year 24 and $37 billion in fiscal year 25 and so on. Really, an emergency, and we're spending money for the next decade? And you mentioned,
yes,
we talked
but you're
about
assuming that you're assuming that we're all economically rational. I can easily understand. We get the economy going. I mean, it's going to go gangbusters throughout the rest of the year. And President Biden's going to say, see, we spent all that money. We spent it wisely. We got the economy to recover. I can make that case.
Well, yeah, sure they will make that case. But the ordinary good sense of Americans will say, wait a minute, I'm doing okay. Why did we give me a $1,400 check?
But people are not doing okay, so the overwhelming majority are not going to say that. Guys, before COVID, nearly 80% of Americans were already living paycheck to paycheck. That's before COVID. Now imagine what it's like after COVID. There was this incredible fact that I saw, I think it was Matt Brunig who tweeted it, at the very peak of the first wave of COVID, there was a time when just over 50% of Americans didn't have a job. Weren't working. Some other facts that were incredible. What was it? I think 40% of Americans at some point during this were food insecure. It's nearly half the country in what's supposed to be the richest country in the world. Food insecure. Nearly, I think it was 32% of the country couldn't pay rent or their mortgage. I mean, this thing, guys, it's a pandemic, and it's a subsequent, I think it's fair to call it a depression. I mean, maybe you could say deep recession. I don't know. But there's a colossal downturn. I mean, this thing absolutely obliterated people. And he's out there like, I think people are going to go, I don't even need this money. What? Just because you have a whiteboard and you have a bunch of stuff scribbled on it, bunch of numbers, doesn't mean you're making a good point, Carl. He really thinks like, oh, I have a whiteboard and I'm scribbling numbers and this guy's got a British accent, so we have to be right about stuff, right? Aren't the optics of this wonderful? But look at what he's saying. He's like, oh, voters may regret the spending bill in the future. What's that based on, Carl? Dickie McGee's Act. It's based on nothing. Because over 70% of the country supports this bill right now. Over 70%. 59% of Republicans support this bill. So when he says voters may regret this in the future, what's he basing that off of? Nothing. He's pulling it directly out of Karl Rove's anus. That's what he's doing. He's making it up. Why? Because he thinks that. Why? Because he's wealthy. He's rich. And he doesn't like anything that helps regular people. He only wants to help his corporate donors and billionaires. He says, how many of these people are going to say, why am I getting these checks? A very, very small number, Carl. A very small number of people. And by the way, even if you don't, let's say there are some who don't need the check. A much more likely response is like, oh, even though I don't need this, I still like it. Like, that's more likely to happen. Then he brings up, this is the hackiest partisan attack of all time. He brings up how the Senate turned down denying checks to felons. It was a virtue signaling posture thing that the Republicans did, but the reason why it's so ridiculous is that the same two bills under Trump, the exact same thing happened where checks got cut to felons. You want to know why? Because they're Americans. By the way, you want to know where the money really ends up going? To the families of the felons. So what do they want to do? You want to deny the money going to the families of felons? You have somebody in your family, you did something wrong, so now you should suffer as a result of it? And again, it happened under Trump. The felons got the checks. They didn't say anything about it then. In fact, these idiots voted for it. Tom Cotton was making the same criticism. He voted for a bill that cut checks to felons. Spare me, spare me, spare me this bullshit hack attack. He even brings up college students are going to get checks as if that's a bad thing. Go talk to a few college students. Hey, are you happy they're getting a check? They're going to be like, hell yeah, bitch. Are you kidding me? Absolutely. And then, of course, the go-to final argument that these clowns make is always about the debt and the deficit. It gets so expensive. It's going to cost so much money. You know what else costs a lot of money? Trump's tax cuts for the rich from 2017, 83% of the benefits of that bill went to the wealthy. 83%. It added nearly $2 trillion to the deficit. Karl Rove supported those tax cuts. Why? He doesn't really care about the debt and the deficit. He just wants to give all the money to billionaires and the wealthy and corporations, his buddies at the country club. That's what he wants. If he actually had some sort of principled concern against the debt and the deficit, he would have said we can't be for these tax cuts because they're irresponsible, because they're adding to the debt and the deficit, and I can't have that. I need some, if I'm going to do tax cuts, I need to make it deficit neutral. But he didn't say that. None of them said that because they don't really care. This is bullshit. The deficit hawkery is complete bullshit. You know what else we spend a colossal amount of money on and nobody bats an eyelash? The military. We have the biggest military in the world. By far and away, we spend more than at least the next 10 biggest countries combined. And most of them are our allies. We don't need to spend that much money. They're choosing to spend that much money. Did you know the F-35-2 fighter jet, it cost nearly $2 trillion to create the damn thing, and it barely works. There was a period where it didn't work at all. $2 trillion on a fighter jet? Did he say anything about that? Oh my God, this costs so much money. What are we doing? That old F-35 isn't good enough? What are we doing? He never said anything about that. He's in favor of a blank check for the military. He's in favor of a blank check for tax cuts for the wealthy. The only time he trots out the whiteboard and complains about how expensive something is when the people get a little bit of help. And by the way, I do mean a little bit of help. Because this bill should have been $2,000 checks. It should have had $15 minimum wage. It didn't have those things. But he's mad that people are getting a $3,000 child tax credit, $300 unemployment, $1,400 checks. He's mad that over 1 million pensions were saved under this bill. He's mad that this bill bailed out states. Anything that's for regular people, he's going to come out and bitch and moan and whine and cry about the debt and the deficit, even though he doesn't care about it. Because if he did care about it, he'd rail against military spending and say we need to reduce it. And he would also rail against the tax cuts for the rich. So, I mean, listen, I don't know how else to say it. These guys are totally full of shit, and he made it up. And thankfully, these guys are always going to lose this argument. The bill is over 70% liked. 59% of Republicans like it. You want to know why? Because times are tough. And when you give people some help, they go, thank you, I needed that help. So they're fighting a losing argument. But I do love it when they go mask off. I do love it when they go mask off. And this is why I say you need a strong, robust, aggressive, loud left with backbone that doesn't back down on issues like Medicare for all and $15 minimum wage and universal basic income. Because if you unapologetically argue for those things, which are so wildly popular, you bait these morons into defending their unpopular positions, and then everybody runs away from them. That's how you build a strong left. Fight them on our turf, on our terms. Go ahead, argue with me about UBI. Have you seen the recent polls on UBI? It's wildly popular now. It wasn't previously. It is now. You want to know why? Because again, times are tough. And a social security check for everybody is a glorious idea. It's the most direct way to help people. So you want to fight me on that? Fight me on that, son. Let's argue. Let's debate it. Bait these idiots into defending their unpopular positions because that's all they have. They win when they're not having the conversation on economics and class. They win when they shift the discussion and the debate into the culture wars. When they bring up Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head, now just Potato Head. They win when it's Pepe Le Pew and all that other shit because they divert the conversation and derail it. And what they do is they appeal to average people on cultural grounds and make them think, well, if these people agree with me on cultural stuff, they probably agree with me on economic stuff too. No. Read Thomas Frank, What's the Matter with Kansas? This is the same trick that was used in the 2000s by conservatives. They would use the issue of abortion, the issue of gay marriage, the issue of religion to appeal to working class people and get those working class people to support them, but it was a bait and switch. A, vote for me on these cultural grounds and the social issues ground, and then I'm going to support the oligarchs and the plutocrats and the kleptocrats and give them endless tax cuts and endless subsidies and bailouts, and I'm going to destroy unions and lower wages, and the list goes on and on. So, but this is what they really believe, and I need you to take note of that, and I need you to remember that. In the middle of a pandemic and what's effectively a depression, this is the argument that Karl Rove is making. Never said anything about the debt and the deficit when it was for giving more money to his billionaire buddies, ever. Never said anything about the deficit when it came to imperialism and endless war, ever. Ever. He only says, oh, hold on, what are we doing? When it's a little bit of help for the people.